As the war between Russia and Ukraine continues to escalate, as does the threat of nuclear war continue to go up as well. What we see is Russia has now changed their laws once again when it comes to the process of how they have to orient themselves under that of first strike and second strike ruling. Well, the thing that's crazy about this is they also just finished an intercontinental ballistic missile with the capability of carrying a nuclear payload that can fly for weeks on end. I do not know exactly how this works. I don't understand the process of how it would actually be able to keep this fuel going, or if it's something that just puts itself into orbit, establishes itself within a geosynchronous orbit, or uses the lack of friction when it comes to the upper atmosphere to carry itself further and faster to consistently keep itself in momentum, using the Coriolis effect to keep going around the planet. So here's the deal. What people don't understand is that as this war consistently goes up, so does the threat of nuclear conflict, and with it comes the fact that people need to really understand the dangers of what nuclear bombs can do and the damage that can truly happen. We are so far detached from the historical context of what happened to places like Hiroshima and Nagasaki that we do not realize the devastating capacity of what these bombs are actually capable of. I believe that one needs to be dropped in a desolate area, completely devoid of life, whether it's in some portion of the ocean, whether it's in some massive stretch of desert. There needs to be a massive display of force that is shown, not from any scale when it comes to the nature of one superpower showing any force of dominance over another, but when it comes to humanity, showing humanity what it means when we are to go to this scale and we are to ramp up all of the escalatory processes of foreign policy that will take us to the process of possibly going into a nuclear winter after that of a nuclear holocaust. Let's go ahead and jump into this. Let's go. We're going to be using Josie, the redheaded libertarian, as our jumping off point. She says Ukraine could have had a peace deal, but no. The US had to have their proxy war. And she's absolutely correct. If you're unfamiliar with what she's talking about, and this is in the beginning of this conflict, and in the beginning, I mean the beginning of the invasion, not the beginning of when the West overthrew the duly elected government in Ukraine to overthrow the democratically elected president to establish a pro-Western leader. No, we're talking about when Putin went into Ukrainian soil, and here we see what happened. Within a month of the conflict starting, or roughly a month after, there was a peace agreement to be drawn up, a ceasefire, and with that, what happened? The West responded in kind by sending NATO ally Boris Johnson to go ahead and go scuttle the peace agreement, and what's happened since then? 500,000 people, Ukrainian citizens, have died, God knows how many Russians, and with it, only more people will die in the future if this war does not come to an end. The US and the West are completely okay with Ukraine being completely ground into the dirt as long as it means we have the capability of bleeding Russia dry on the economic scale of the world front. Alrighty, now let's jump into Mario Wall. Breaking Russia to deploy nuclear-powered missile. Threatens West with response. Putin says Russia will deploy a nuclear-powered missile soon. This comes after a successful test of a nuclear-powered and nuclear-capable cruise missile with a potential range of many thousands of miles. Putin also declined to rule out the possibility that it could carry out weapons tests involving nuclear explosions for the first time in more than 3 decades. And if you're unfamiliar with that, what he's talking about and referencing is the Tsar bomb. Go ahead and go look into the history of nuclear bombs dropping. It's actually quite fascinating. Today, Putin warned the West of a response to the pressure and his willingness to end the war. There's a preeminently and permanently increasing military and political pressure from the West, he says. We have to respond. I've said many times that it was not us who started the war in Ukraine. On the contrary, we are trying to end it. The West has lost all sense of reality. Ukrainian conflict is not about territories. The issue is about global order, said Vladimir Putin. Zelensky warned Europe that if Ukraine loses, Russia will attack other countries as well. Is Russia posturing again, or is this going to be something akin to what we've seen in the past, like a bluff that they have done many a times before? And here's the deal. I don't know if anyone remembers that alarm signal that went off on your phones in the United States to test the emergency broadcast system. Well, something that would be quite fascinating about that would be if that was why the emergency broadcast system was tested. Granted, they tested every 3 years, so it ended up correlating perfectly with this time frame, but genuinely interesting to think about. Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and jump in, play this clip real quick. Let's go. So, They're talking about the prospect of a nuclear missile capable of flying for weeks on end. And when they say this, do they mean flying around the Earth consistently using fuel? How would that actually work? Or do they mean getting it to establish itself in a geosynchronous orbit and then they can use fuel to control its re-entry? But either way, that's a lot of heat that's going to be put on a missile. So that's something that I'm really curious about, and I don't understand entirely how that would work.
По поводу угрозы ядерной войны, Светлана Геннадьевна, ну вы правы, такая угроза нарастает, здесь что греха таить. По поводу того, что Россия ни при каких обстоятельствах не применит первый, но если не применит первый, ни при каких обстоятельствах, значит и второй тоже не применит, потому что возможности применения в случае нанесения ядерного удара по нашей территории, они сильно ограничены. Тем не менее, у нас стратегия наша применения средств защиты, а именно как защиту мы рассматриваем оружие массового поражения, ядерное оружие, она вся настроена вокруг так называемого ответно-встречного удара.
Alrighty, so you can see the mindset of Putin when he talks about the fact of we do not wish to use nuclear weapons, but we're not against it. Also, he says, and this is a big one, we do not wish to strike first, but if we don't strike first, if we're talking about nuclear weapons, is there even a chance we'll be able to strike second? And that is a major benefactor that people do not think about when it comes to the escalatory process of nuclear war and why people end up thinking about the process of hitting the button first. We are not dealing with a Reagan and Gorbachev moment. This is not a Kennedy and Khrushchev time frame. We are not talking about world leaders who are actively against seeing people be thrown into the meat grinder. We are talking about political gangsters who have no desire to see what's best for the people of the world as long as it means they get to keep their power. Alrighty, now we're going to go ahead and jump into this, and it says, who remembers when NATO head Stoltenberg said this? And this is the breaking down of the Ukraine war narrative in real time. I'm going to go ahead and jump into this and play it. Let's go.
President Putin actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO close to his borders.
Flashback.
This is fundamentally not about NATO expansion.
It was never about NATO enlargement.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO expanding toward Russia.
This was never about NATO.
It's absolutely nothing to do with NATO expansionism.
And it has nothing to do with NATO.
This is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not really about NATO.
This is not about NATO.
Seriously, it's not about NATO.
This was never about NATO.
It was never about NATO. Let's be honest.
This doesn't have anything to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO at all.
Yeah, he's claiming it's like security purposes, but we can see the clear reason.
But NATO is not the reason.
This is not about NATO expansion. This is about the democratic expansion.
Ukraine bans religious organizations.
We are protecting democracy right now.
Ukraine is banning political parties.
Because it's a democracy.
Ukraine restricts books and music.
It's about democracy.
Ukraine won't hold elections.
It's about democracy.
And it's not about NATO expansion.
This war in Ukraine is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
That's not about NATO.
It has nothing to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO expansion.
It's not about NATO expansion.
Nothing to do with NATO.
It isn't really about NATO. It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO enlargement.
In fact, it has nothing to do with NATO.
It's not about NATO encroaching.
It's not about NATO. NATO is just a fictitious, imaginary adversary for Mr. Putin and for Russia.
It was never about NATO.
That's not what it's been about. It's been about him trying to expand his sphere of influence.
Hang on, I mean, the two are not mutually exclusive. Obviously, Russia has wished for a sphere of influence over Ukraine, but if the West had not challenged Russian interests so directly, I think that there was a chance to avoid this war.
What is the age-old saying? If you repeat a line long enough and consistently enough, you'll eventually have the truth. Well, isn't that fascinating? It appears that's exactly what we just saw when the establishment, out of nowhere in the corporate press, just seemed to turn on a dime and just say the exact same thing verbatim. It's almost like they got their script and they were told what to say, and they got their NPC programming update so they could disseminate it down to the populace so they could consistently program the masses with their propaganda. Anyways, we're going to go ahead and move on from that before I go on a tirade. Here we see, Russia has tested a nuclear-powered missile and could provoke a global atomic test ban, Putin says. Well, why is this the case? You know what? Screw it. We're going on the media tirade. The reason why so many people bought the narrative when it came to what was going on with the corporate press and what they were pushing with the history of the Ukraine conflict is because many a times what many people have in their mindset when it comes to the understanding of the United States and the military is that of being the world empire. And if you're the world empire, that means you are someone who believes that we have to be in every single war and every single conflict across the globe consistently because that's just what the US does. And they don't think about the process that they're in empire mentality, but it is what they're operating on. And it's not that they're bad people because they do this. They mean well and they want to see people prosper, but they do not realize the metrics with which they've pushed because they've been propagandized into this perspective is something that is so dangerous to so many people, which has led to the deaths of so many people like we saw with all of the people who have now died in Ukraine because of this conflict. And this could have been stopped all with that peace agreement that was going to be settled, but Boris Johnson went in and shot it straight in the head, put it in the dirt, and said, no, this is not something the West and NATO can stand for, and with it, we've seen the flower of the Ukrainian youth be completely put into the dirt. All right. Here's the deal. The people that believe the narrative, they're not bad. And the reason they believe it is because the person at the front of the room is the person who's always been the person giving them the orders. They believe the person at the front of the room wouldn't lie to them because they've been inculcated through so many years of government education, as well as the process of themselves not being Machiavellian liars who are willing to be tricksters to manipulate their fellow man. And with that, if they wouldn't even go to lie to their neighbor, why would it be that they would believe the person at the front of the room who's supposed to be telling them the truth about world politics would lie to them? They wouldn't. They can't put themselves in the mindset of how evil so many of these people genuinely are. And a perfect example of how evil so many of these people are would be someone like Walter Duranty during the time of the Soviet Union. And what happened was Walter Duranty went to the Soviet Union to go and explore the plights of communism, but he himself was a communist sympathizer. And what did he write when he came back? The Russians are not starving, they are merely tightening their belts. And if you have to tighten your belt because you have a lack of food, it is because you are starving. The fact that the journalist class would be willing to lie about something like this just shows the depravity at which they will stoop to at every single turn, and do not think it has ended now. It is something that consistently pervades the entirety of the media class. Alrighty, let's jump in. Russia has tested a nuclear-powered missile and could revoke a global atomic test ban, Vladimir Putin says. Interesting. Here we see Russia has successfully tested an experimental nuclear-powered cruise missile, President Vladimir Putin said Thursday, while also warning that the country's parliament could revoke its ratification of a treaty banning nuclear tests. In a speech at a forum of foreign policy experts, Putin announced that Russia has effectively completed the development of the cruise missile and the Sarmat heavy intercontinental ballistic missile and will work on putting them into production. We conducted the latest and last successful test of the nuclear-powered global-range cruise missile, he said, without elaborating. His statement was the first announcement of a successful test of this, which translates to Storm Petrel in English. It was first mentioned by Putin in 2018, so they've been working on this for quite some time. Little is known about the missile, which was codenamed Skyfall by NATO, and many Western experts have been skeptical about it, noting that a nuclear engine could be highly unreliable, or noting that a nuclear engine could be highly unreliable. And here we see an article from Reuters. Putin says Russia has tested next-generation nuclear weapon. And I went through this article, and it has little to no nuance, just like the AP article has. It has no proper actual analysis. I understand that they're trying to convey the information, and this was updated roughly an hour ago based on when I've gotten it, and they still haven't put out anything. All they did was change a couple words. It's basically reiterating the same exact thing that the AP talked about, and here's the deal. Nuclear escalation is something that we absolutely need to worry about. I myself do not wish to die in that of a nuclear hellfire or be one of the survivors and die under that of the nuclear winter. I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Thank you for watching if you got this far. Do not buy the propaganda that is consistently pushed out about the corporate press, about the machinations of the elite class and how they push all of the evil shit that they do when it comes to foreign policy. The thing is, people are not allowed to kill people. That's called murder. And politicians kill people. They just get away with it because we call it foreign policy. Thanks for watching. Thumbs up if you liked it. Thumbs down if you didn't. Tell me where I'm wrong in the comment section down below. Subscribe if you like this kind of content. Stay lovely. Stay great. Peace out.